coming. I want to particularly thank David and Carol Jankowski and the entire staff at the Duxbury Library, because all year long this year they have been wonderful in helping us with this series of the History Through the Lens, as we called it, and this is the final one. I want to thank you all who actually came in August and couldn't hear or see anything because we had technology meltdown. We are now hopefully all in good shape. So, we are wrapping up the 375th year of Duxbury, and it's kind of fitting that we are talking about the Wright family of Duxbury, and we'll get into that in a bit. I don't know, David, do you think we could turn down the lights just slightly so people can see the slides maybe a little better? And I want to thank my son Will being at the controls here. But we're going to talk. I'm going to talk hopefully only for about 40 minutes about the Wright family, and then we're going to talk 5 minutes about the movie that we'll be screening afterwards, called The Magnificent Ambersons, which is a film by Orson Welles, and sort of why we chose that one. And then we'll take a short break, 5-minute break for stretching and bathrooms and all. But during the talk, during the movie, please, there's food, there's water, there's just snacking material over there. So feel free to get up and wander over there. But let's get into the Wright family, because they've been a fascination of mine for many a year, and I think I know some of you have heard about them. This is their estate, which stood where Duxbury High School does today on St. George Street. And this is the estate somewhat in its declining years, and we'll get into that in a bit. But if we could have the next slide, we'll run through the cast of characters of the Wrights. But when we think of the Wright family, we almost immediately go to thinking about the Wright building, which was the former town library, and it was given by Mrs. Wright back in 1909, and now has had a second life as the archives for the Duxbury Rural and Historical Society and the Duxbury Student Union. So we'll also get back to this building and the reasons for it, but when the name Wright pops up, this is what most people think about. So we could have the next slide. But this was the original building that the Wright family gave to the town of Duxbury in honor of their son. And this building is still there today. It's the, some of you remember it as the Old Town Office building. It's on St. George Street. It's now the Healing Hands massage place. It's painted white. But this was their original gift to the town as the town library. And it stood originally where the Wright building is today. And then when they built the present Wright building, they moved this building to where it is now and gave it to the town as town offices. So this was their original gift to the town. It was on their estate, and they it actually had been moved twice. It had been across the street, moved to the Wright building site, and then moved down St. George Street a bit. So this building is a bit of a should have wheels on it, but it was given by the Wright family. So if we can have the next one. So let's get into the cast of characters of the Wright family, because they're a fascinating family. This is not a very good picture, I'm afraid, and I'm not exactly sure which of the Wright family is in it, but it's labeled the Wright family. It's from the archives of the Historical Society. I believe it's the son John Wright, and possibly either his wife or his sister. But they're up at, it was in a couple, it was with a couple pictures of them at the Miles Standish Monument. So it's up in the Miles Standish Monument area, and they're in their horse and buggy there. So if we could have the next slide. This is George Wellman Wright, and he was the father of the family, if you will. And he bought his estate here in Duxbury in the 1868. He was born and brought up in Boston and Brookline. He came from a very wealthy family. The wealth of the Wrights was really quite amazing. I mean, it was Vanderbilt-size wealth, and that's quite interesting in the fact that they landed here in Duxbury. But this is a portrait that's now in the Wright Building in the Historical Society archives. And so his father made his fortune through dry goods and things like that. They had an estate in Brookline, and we'll get into that in a little bit. But then George and his brother moved to New York, became sort of bon vivants, but also started a cotton export-import company. And this was even during the Civil War, so in the 1860s. So they made a lot of money. They were in Memphis and New Orleans. So I don't know too much about their company, but my guess is they were kind of playing both sides of the war effort, and there was a lot of, but they made a lot of money. I mean, you possibly could call them robber barons, but they made a whole huge other fortune through the cotton brokering that they did, and of course both sides needed that for uniforms as well as just material. He bought the estate here in Duxbury in 1868, and it was going cheap. It was an old Weston estate, and the house, in fact, was built by Ezra Weston II, so King Caesar's son, Gershom Weston, and he and his brother had a tussle, and he lost the estate, and the brother put it up for sale very cheaply, and George Wright bought it. Why he came to Duxbury, we don't really know. I think possibly it was the cheap real estate, but he also was clearly associated with Stephen Gifford, who was quite an influential man in Duxbury, but also he was the clerk of the Massachusetts State Senate for years. So he was a very influential man at the state level, and they had business dealings through the years. So my guess is that it was through the Gifford family that the Wrights first came to Duxbury. And we have to think about Duxbury in the 1860s. Very depressed, very sort of run out of steam, and the Wrights came and injected this amazing energy into Duxbury. Not just money, but energy, and really helped to revitalize Duxbury. At the same time, they were just ahead of when the railroad came into Duxbury, when the Miles Standish monument got started, when the Miles Standish Hotel got built. So there was this whole burst of energy and money after the Civil War. So George Wright was part of that. And we'll get back to George in a little bit as well. So if we could have the next slide. This is his wife, Georgiana Buckham Wright. And she also came from great wealth. She was born and raised in New York City. Her father was a very prominent lawyer. She was an only child. She clearly doted on. And she married George Wright in 1858, I believe, when she was 21 and he was 37. So there was a large age difference between them. This is a later portrait of her that's also over in the Wright Building. But she was a fascinating person. We'll see some, if we could have the next slide, Will. This is Georgiana with her mother. She's the child, and that's her mother. This is a very well-known portrait painter of the time, Henry Inman. This particular portrait is at the MFA, donated by Georgiana, and Henry Inman was a family friend of her family, of the Buckhams, and he painted her father, who we'll see in a second, she and her mother. There were a number of portraits that Georgiana had in her possession, and they all mostly ended up at the MFA. But this is Georgiana as about a 5-year-old. And she had a very, I hate to bring a more literary allusions to this, but I think we have to kind of think of the Edith Wharton era of New York City, and she was part of that crowd, part of that very wealthy, very socially prominent New York pre-Civil War, post-Civil War era of the booming of New York. So if we could have the next slide. This is her father, George Buckham, came from Scotland, well-known lawyer, again made quite a bit of money. This is an Inman portrait of him, and that also, I don't believe this one is at the MFA. I think it's in Cleveland for some reason. So next slide. Here we have Georgiana at her first marriage to George Wright. Like I said, she was 21, and again, she looks like something out of Edith Wharton. They got married in New York City and lived there for several years, but by 1865 they had left New York, although not totally, as we'll find out, and moved to Brookline, to the Wright estate there, and then by 1868 had come to Duxbury. But this is her just around the time of her marriage. And she had 4 children. She and George had 4 children, and we'll find out more about them in a second. So if we could have the next slide. Here's Georgiana at about the time of her second marriage. She married her husband George's nephew, William. And we'll learn a little bit more about William in a second. They were more of the same age, she and William, and I've never come across any kind of speculation, anything about whether this was, how this happened. This was pretty common in that kind of very socially prominent, very wealthy family to keep it all in the family. And William had lived with Georgiana and George's family for a number of years. So, and we'll hear more about that in a second. If we could have the next slide. Here's Georgiana out of a scrapbook that I believe is here in the Duxbury Library. She's on their yacht, Lucille. It's, again, I'm afraid not a great picture, but very interesting hat. I'm not sure what that is on top of her, but it looks like some sort of dead bird or birds. But she's in some kind of a fur, and they did a lot of touring about, as wealthy families did. So if we could have the next slide. And here's Georgiana in about 1903. And she's, this is out of a thing at the Historical Society, but she's greeting a battery that came to, Army that encamped on the Wright lands out on Powder Point. So that's her in her later years. And we'll get back to Georgiana because she really was the last of the Wrights, and she has a fascinating history after her husbands and children. So if we could have the next slide. Here's her second husband, William Wright. Now, he was not born William Wright. He was born William James Todd. Now, remember I said he was a nephew. His mother was George W. Wright's, Wellman Wright's sister, and she married a man named Todd and had 3 sons. Seems to have divorced Todd, and he sort of drifted around. But very quickly after that divorce, the 3 sons and William's mother, Mary Todd, took, and there are records in the Massachusetts archives, they took the name Wright. So they all became Wrights. Again, probably to kind of keep the money in the family. This is a portrait of him as a somewhat young man. We have, if we could have the next slide. Here he is in the Civil War. He was in a Massachusetts infantry and saw some action down in Virginia. And you know, a very handsome man. Soon after the war, he joined his uncle's household here in Duxbury and lived here all the rest of his life, basically. He was remembered by many old-time Duxbury families for his generosity. He was also a gentleman farmer. You have to remember the Wrights didn't work for there after a certain point. But he was interested in cranberries. He had cranberry bogs here in Duxbury. The Alden, behind the Alden School, the bird sanctuary, that trout pond was part of their estate, and he was very interested in cultivating trout. He was a big supporter of the Marshfield Fair, and his large interest was in horses, and we'll talk about that in a second. But he had an entire stable of horses and ponies and all that was over in the Onion Hill area next to the main Wright estate. So he had a lot of he was also very much involved in real estate on Powder Point, Duxbury Beach, places like that. He was the real instigator behind the building of the Powder Point Bridge. In fact, paid for a third of it to be built. So again, a fascinating character who was known for his generosity to the local Duxbury people who worked for the estate as well, and worked for the family, and well remembered as, he was known as Willie, and they called him Uncle Willie, many of them, because he was so generous to families over the years. If we could have the next slide. And here he is in later years, on the left there, chatting with one of the commanders out at Powder Point. But he was always interested in keeping up. He had this battery come to Powder Point and encamp there for a couple weeks, and there's some great photographs of that in this album. So again, a man of varied interests. He was also a state legislator from Plymouth County for several years as well, when he was younger. So although not working for his living, he was very active and busy throughout Duxbury and Plymouth County. We can have the next slide. All right, this is the eldest son of the Wright family, John Wright. That's him on the left. And again, not sure who this woman is who is with him. It's either his wife, Sally, or his sister, Florence. John is somewhat still of an enigma. He was not the oldest in the family. He was the second, but he was the oldest son. And he disappears from, it's very hard to trace, for about 20 years. And I'm wondering, for many years there were rumors in Duxbury and sort of stories that you hear from some of the old-timers that there was a Wright son who was a ne'er-do-well and was a drunk and a wastrel, and I think there's probably some kernel of truth to some of those stories, and I would put my money on John as being that source of some of that story. We lose track of him in the 1880s, and for a good 20 years until about 1900, he's hard to trace through censuses or anything. He just doesn't appear. Where he finally does appear is in Lynchburg, Virginia, of all places, where he marries a woman named Sally Cosby, who was just about his age, and they had a very brief marriage before John died at age 45 of cerebral hemorrhage, but seems to have been a very happy, brief marriage. So this may be Sally Cosby, I'm not sure of it, but she was very well liked by her mother-in-law, and we'll hear more about that again later in the story. But John is fascinating, and I wish we knew more about him and why he ended up in Lynchburg, Virginia, and all of that. But my guess, and this is, like I said, this picture comes from a couple photographs that are in the Wright Building archives, and they're in one of the windows of the Miles Standish Monument as it's being finished, about 1898. So that's John, the eldest son. If we could have the next slide. I think the daughter, I don't have a picture of the eldest daughter, Anna Buckham Wright. I think that may be her. This is Georgiana here, and that's William Wright. My guess is maybe the woman in the white is Anna Wright. She was the eldest daughter of George and Georgiana. Again, a fascinating character out of Edith Wharton, I think. She had a number of engagements to socially prominent men that were broken. In fact, one of them was a count from Canada who turned out to have been a fraud and left all kinds of debts all over Boston. She had two marriages. She married a rather well-known, not exceedingly well-known, but you can Google him and pull up a number of his buildings. An architect by the name of Van Campen Taylor from New York City. His real name was Benjamin Van Campen Taylor, and they married when they were in their 40s. They had a very long engagement, it seems. There's in the scrapbook here in the library an announcement of their engagement in the late 1880s, and they were not married until a month after her father died in 1897. Now, why that happened, you can create all kinds of stories. Did he not approve of Van Campen Taylor? Were they waiting because he was sick? We don't know, but it was a very long engagement. And they had a house in Duxbury on Powder Point, and some of the Wright real estate holdings is that part of Powder Point where Russell Road and King Caesar Road come through there, and up to about Weston Road. They bought a chunk of the old King Caesar estate and divided it into summer cottage lots. And I'm wondering if some of those early summer houses in that area were designed by Van Campen Taylor. I don't have any proof of that, but my guess is that he might have done that. He died suddenly, dropped dead in the house on Powder Point, and she married shortly after, 2 years after that, a distant relative named Russell Wellman Moore, and then she died probably of cancer in her early 50s in 1916. She was the last of the Wright children, if you will, to die. But they lived in New York City much of the time, and we'll see some places that they lived. But they did have a summer place here, and clearly frequently came back to Duxbury. If we could have the next slide, Will. This is George Buckham Wright, the second son, third child of George and Georgiana. He is the one who the library was dedicated to. He died tragically in 1888 at age 21. He fell down an elevator shaft in Boston. Why that happened, he lingered for several days, according to the reports. It happened in the middle of the day. Why it happened, who knows? You know, there was, again, those rumors floating around Duxbury for years and years that he was drunk and that's why he fell down the elevator shaft. There's no indication in the news reports about that, but he was clearly beloved by his family, and just particularly for his mother, this was a tragic loss. And so they dedicated the wooden library to him in his memory. St. George Street became St. George Street when its original name was Harmony Street. And then when they built the brick Wright building in 1909, a number of the other Wrights had died by then. George, the husband and father of George the younger, had died. The younger daughter had died, and John had died. So that was dedicated to the Wright family members more than particularly to him. So again, sort of tragic, fascinating story. He went to Harvard, and Harvard enters back in the story later on. We don't know if John went to Harvard or not, but there was clearly a close association with Harvard for the Wright family. Have the next slide. And this is Florence Wright, the youngest of the Wrights. This is, again, not a great picture of her, but it's a portrait of her that has a fascinating story. She, again, we only have glimmers of poor Florence. She died very suddenly of meningitis when she was 25 here in Duxbury in 1901. She helped christen the opening of the Powder Point Bridge. She was clearly athletic. She's listed in a number of tennis tournaments and things like that. But this portrait of her turns up in Virginia in a plantation down there called the Haw Plantation, and had been given to the owners of the plantation by a distant relative, where this portrait had been in storage for years and years. And I believe it had to have come through John and his wife Sally, who lived down in Lynchburg, Virginia. And it must have been one of John's prized possessions, passed to his wife, and she lived much longer than John and died in the 40s and probably was put in storage then, and came out through some distant relations to these this family that was renovating this plantation, this old plantation house. They had heard that it was a beautiful pastel of her. They took it out of the crate, and it was all gray charcoal. It wasn't colored at all. So they were disappointed in that. They hung it in their library. And the Haw Plantation in Virginia folklore is known for all of its ghosts. And Florence is one of the ghosts, because soon after they hung it in their library, they heard voices in the library and went in there and there was nobody there. But the portrait began to change. It began to take on color. She began to get skin tone. It turns out she's a redhead with blue eyes, her dress. So the portrait began to get colorized, if you will, after it was hung. And they kept hearing these voices. And then as soon as the portrait came back to full color, the voices stopped. And then there were all these other ghost manifestations of earlier owners of this plantation as well that were happening around the same time. Now you can probably think of maybe some, reason why this portrait suddenly came back to color, but it's a great story, and they had a psychic come to the family, and she felt that the image of Florence was it had supposedly been done and she had died just before the portrait was done. So her spirit was trapped in the portrait, according to the psychic. And when it was taken out of its crate and rehung, she felt at home in this plantation, and the portrait began to come back to life. At least that's the story. So it's a great ghost story about poor Florence. So if we could have the next slide. Here's the Wright estate in its glory. This is their main house, called Pine Hill, and stood where the high school is today. As you can see, it has a mansard or French roof that the Wrights put on. It was really, in its day, quite a building, and they enhanced the estate. It had been Gershom Weston's earlier, so the front part of it was a shipping era mansion, but they embellished it to no end. We can see the next slide. Here it is again from the front, looking at it with its French roof. And they arrived in 1868. There was a huge ball where the governor of Massachusetts and many notable people came in 1869 here to the Wright estate when the French Atlantic Cable arrived in Duxbury. So that was their big kickoff. But they hosted a number of different gatherings over the years at the Wright estate. The 200th anniversary of Duxbury was held on the grounds. The 250th was held there on the grounds, and even the 300th in 1937, once the Wrights were all gone, they did host some of the 300th events on the Wright estate. So if we could have the next slide. Here's the front porch, you know, very evocative of that era, and they had a large number of servants and people who worked the estate for them. You have the next slide, Will. But they kept their connections to New York and to Brookline, and this is one of the places that later in life that Georgiana and William, but particularly Georgiana's daughter Anna and her husbands lived, and it's still there. It's near the Natural History Museum in New York City. It was a very well-known place in New York in its day, and you can see it's been sort of apparently the concrete that much of the facing and the roofing began to crumble, so it was severely reduced from its earlier look. But it was one of those early New York apartment buildings that were co-ops, basically, as we know them today. And it had full service of all kinds of, you know, there was a restaurant down below, and it was a very fancy apartment building in New York. If we could have the next one. This was their earlier place, still also there in New York, 121 Madison Ave. It was known as a home club, which means, again, basically a co-op where the owners actually owned but this was the first building where it was a floor through, where you owned the entire sort of floor. There were 2 apartments apparently on each floor, but you owned one whole half of that building. And the Wrights frequently, you know, went to New York. So have the next one, Will. This is another place that they had on the Back Bay, 326 Dartmouth. It was actually owned by William Wright's mother. So it wasn't that George and Georgiana they visited there, but this was William's mother's place in the Back Bay. Again, very socially prominent place. It came to Georgiana and William. They were married there. Anna Wright was married there. Georgiana died there. William died there. So this was sort of their base of operation in Boston. And like many wealthy families, they had lots of places. The next slide will show us, I'm afraid I don't have a picture of it, but this is their Brookline Estate. And you can see it's just outside of Brookline Village. And this is from 1903, I believe, this map. But the building, unfortunately, is not there. It was taken down soon after Georgiana died. There are apparently a couple stone pillars left. And as far as I can tell, from the Brookline Historical Society, that there are no photographs of that estate. But it was well known in Brookline at the time, and it passed through successions of Wrights. George Wright Sr., the father's father, bought it back in the 1850s, and then it went to this Mary Wright was the mother of William Wright, so she was the Todd that became a Wright, or Wright Todd Wright, I guess, because that's her maiden name. So she inherited it, and then it passed eventually actually to Georgiana as the last of the Wrights. So the next, this is Duxbury. This is from the 1879 Atlas. So we're looking at St. George Street here. Coming here, there's their estate. You can see even then, and this is early on in the Wrights' ownership, you can see the mansion, the outbuildings. They owned a number of the ones on Pine Hill Ave and the back land. But here's this Stephen Gifford just down the street, and I know they were friends, and I think he was the influence to get the Wrights here to Duxbury. If we can see the next slide, this is 1903, so some years after that first map. And you can see that the Wright estate has expanded. And here we are at the main estate building where the high school is, Pine Hill, Lover's Lane, known as Garden Street, Pine Hill Ave. The trotting track sort of vaguely echoes Onion Hill Road today. But they owned all this part of St. George Street as well. As you can see, the original library building there. But they owned a large chunk of St. George Street, as well as a number of Duxbury Beach, a good chunk of Powder Point, the Wright Reservoir area, large land holdings all over Duxbury. So if we could have the next slide, Will. Here's their yacht, the Lucille. There were several Lucilles. There was Big Lucille and Little Lucille, but it was a steam yacht, and they traveled all up and down the East Coast, through the canals, up the Hudson River. There's records in the Wright scrapbook of their travels in the various Lucilles. This Lucille was eventually sold to one of the Vanderbilts. So you can see who the crowd they kind of moved in through the years. And yet they stayed, their base was Duxbury. They were not Newport by any means. We could have the next slide, Will. Here's, again, their estate expanded in many, they poured money, particularly George Wright, as well as William. This is their greenhouse on the estate where they had flowers year-round through the year. This was sort of over towards what's Lover's Lane today, this greenhouse. The next slide will show us, this is the sunken Italian garden. Marble imported from Italy, sort of a vast, beautiful, apparently sunken boxwood enclosed Italian garden that they had designed and all. Again, just from all reports, a gorgeous part of the estate. Next slide, Will. Here's the trotting track with some of William Wright's horses and all. So they really did lead the good life. Next slide, Will. And now we're beginning to phase out from the Wright family, unfortunately. This is John and his wife Sally's cemetery plot in Lynchburg, Virginia. He died in 1906, like I said, when he was 45, very suddenly. She lived until the 40s. She had a life tenancy to the Wright estate, so a number of old-time Duxbury people remember her coming up with a retinue of black servants from the South for the summer in Duxbury in the 1920s. She was left very well off, not just by John, but by his mother, Georgiana, as well. She inherited a lot of money and was clearly very well loved by her mother-in-law. So the next slide, this is Anna and her second husband, Russell Moore, buried in Princeton Cemetery. He was very closely, her second husband, very closely associated with Princeton. There's a large, endowed to this day, chemistry chair at Princeton, known as the Russell Wellman Moore chair. He was the chief chemist for the U.S. Customs Service for years. But you notice the name Wellman, and that's in the Wright family as well, through George Wright's, Senior George Wright's mother. So there's a distant relation between those two. She died in 1916, no children, after 2 marriages. None of the Wright children who did marry had any children. So really the line ended when Anna died. And then it really ended because none of Senior George Wright's brothers or sisters had children either. So the whole line just stopped. But it meant the whole fortune ended up going basically to Georgiana, who was the last of the Wrights. You have the next. Here's the Wright tomb in Mount Auburn, where they're all buried except for Anna and John. They're all there. It's a very modest one in Mount Auburn amongst many prominent Bostonians, but they're all in this crypt kind of area in Mount Auburn. And Georgiana really was the last of the Wrights. If we could have the next slide, Will. Here we're kind of fading out of their time in Duxbury. She lived until 1919. She died of pneumonia, but I have a feeling it was from the effects of the flu outbreak of 1918, which was a common thing for people who had the flu and then they developed pneumonia and died actually from pneumonia. So when she died, it all stopped. The estate was inherited, as was the bulk of the monies, by Harvard. Although, remember, John's wife Sally had the life tenancy to Pine Hill, so the Pine Hill was continued to be lived in, but she gave up her life tenancy in 1932 and stopped coming to Duxbury. And then the Harvard sold the Wright estate to the Ellison family, who never lived at the Wright estate and kept caretakers there. And it really began to kind of become the local haunted mansion, I guess, and you can begin to see it in this picture from the 1930s. Can you have the next slide, Will? Here it is again, not a great picture, but it looks like something out of the Addams Family. Next slide. Here's the back end of the estate, where the servants end. This is from the 1950s, so you can see the estate really is kind of going to wreck and ruin there by the 1950s. But still, gorgeous trees, beautiful landscape, plantings and all there, but really not lived in except by caretakers. Next slide, Will. And here we are with the estate coming down in 1966. The Ellison family gave the land to the town of Duxbury for a new school. and the town took down the estate, bulldozed it for what was to be a new middle school, and that building that's there now began as a middle school and became the high school in the 1970s. So the estate met as kind of a sad end here. There are souvenirs of the Wright estate all over the country. People pilfered, but there was exotic wood. There was apparently gorgeous walnut, even in the stables and things like that. And even today, they're working on building the new field house behind the current high school, and they encountered, when they dug the foundation, they encountered a foundation with pipes and all things, and it very likely came from the stables of the Wright estate. It was not associated with the school buildings at all. So that area is still being haunted, if you will, by the Wrights. So we have the next slide. And this is really how we kind of need to remember the Wrights, that they were magnanimous. They spread their wealth around. You know, they were not of any strata really of Duxbury society when they lived here, because they were so well above it, and yet they did mingle with the people who lived in town here and were well thought of, and it's interesting that Georgiana in her later years gave money to the World War I effort. She endowed an ambulance, she endowed an entire wing of a hospital in France, she endowed everybody who had were in the beds at that hospital, like gave money to them as they left those beds. She endowed a French orphanage. She knew she was the last of the line, and she tried to give it away as much as she could. So, and I think there's one more slide. Is there? Yep. And again, that's how we should remember the Wright family and their estate. Again, this kind of looks like, this is a great segue because it looks to me like something out of the Magnificent Ambersons. I want to talk for 3 minutes about the movie we'll see in a short time. This is, again, you've seen this picture before, but the reason we chose the Orson Welles film we'll see in a few minutes is because it's of this same era, it's of this same kind of family. The Magnificent Ambersons, based on a 1918 Booth Tarkington novel. It's set actually in the Midwest, in Indianapolis, and it's about a family like the Wrights and what happens to them over the years. And it's sort of how they don't change with the times. And I don't know if we could say that about the Wrights, but you know, there's enough echoes there that I think it's a great parallel to, and it makes me think, you know, we tend to think of Duxbury's history as compartmentalized, and every town had their Wright family, and I think that's really kind of the last thing I want to sort of leave you with, is that every town had their wealthy family that had some tragedy, maybe died out, maybe the estate didn't last, but you can name almost any town in this country and they had their Wright family or their Amberson family. Orson Welles' film was done in 1942, so that's an important year because we're seeing the shadows of the war, World War II, sort of in the film. It's about this era, the 1890s and all, but it could not help be influenced by the era that it was made, and it's really considered one of Orson Welles' damaged jewels. He did it right after Citizen Kane, and he lost. They took away the editing from him for various reasons. So there was a huge chunk of the movie cut out. he used a lot of theatrical techniques and lighting, and many of his, Orson Welles, you know, did radio shows and had the Mercury Theater in New York, and really was theater based, and you can see that in the movie and in his movie making. But he always regretted how the Magnificent Ambersons came out. The ending was changed without his wishes. Huge chunks were taken out. The movie runs about 88 minutes, so just a short under an hour and a half, but it was a 2-hour movie when he left off editing. And the most significant change, he also did some really neat things, before we get to the ending, some really neat things with how they rehearsed for 5 weeks. He employed actors that were very different than the run-of-the-mill studio actors. He used some of his own actors, but he pulled the young man of George Amberson was a cowboy actor, and that's all he had done until the Magnificent Ambersons, and he's very good. He pulled a silent movie actress out of retirement to star in the Magnificent Ambersons, so he did some very creative things. He used lots of different camera shots that nobody had done. His set was constructed as a full mansion on the sound studio lots in Los Angeles, and when you see the films, in the film, they're on a sleigh and outside. That was filmed in a giant LA ice house, warehouse where ice was kept, so that they could have the breath, you know, be seen and all. But he did lose his ability to maintain control of the movie, and the ending was changed. He had a very much more melancholic end to the original thing that he always tried to, over the years he tried to get control of the movie again and redo it, and he never could. But I'll spoil it a little bit, that the end of the movie, where you see Aunt Fanny in a boarding house, his ending was, the final shot was it pulled away, and the boarding house was the Amberson mansion that had declined and been turned into a boarding house. But you don't get that in the film we'll see today. So those were some of the things that really were drastically changed without his wishes or ability to control that. So I think we'll end here. We'll take a short break to stretch, have something to eat, have a bathroom break. I'm happy to answer any questions about the Wrights or what, and then we'll try to get the movie rolling in a short time so people can see that. So.